Hey everyone! So for people watching this video taking the class asynchronously, there was a glitch with Zoom, and the first 15 minutes of class were not recorded. So I'm filming this after the fact. I'm going to add it to the beginning of the classroom video. It wasn't really going over any of the new stuff. It was predominantly just doing review for the last class, but it led to some really good student questions that I think did a really helpful job setting up what we were going to talk about in the last class. So I'm going to try to recreate the little bit that got cut off, where the recording wasn't really working, and then I'll just go straight into the normal video once I get people sort of caught up. So we'll do the quick little review of the Nietzsche and what sort of matters from the Nietzsche from last class. Right, we were talking about the possibility of an alternative to the ascetic priestly mode evaluation. And remember, the priestly mode of evaluation that we were talking about was this sort of sense of renunciation, right? That I give up things. I give up meat, I give up sex, I fast, various kinds of activities where I sort of deny myself normal pleasures. And I do this for the sake of some higher world beyond. Okay. There is the true world and the apparent world. And the aesthetic ideal is that the apparent world should be used as sort of a bridge to get me to the true one. And this distinction between the true world and the apparent world, right? That's what we were calling last class, this sort of idea of transcendence. That's what transcendence fundamentally means. It is pointing to some world beyond the world I normally see, the world I normally encounter. So what is the alternative to this aesthetic priestly ideal, and what's the alternative to thinking about things in terms of transcendence? We ended last class with the sort of what sort of struck all of us as a sort of shocking claim that Nietzsche ended with, that scientific materialism which sort of holds itself up and understands itself as being an alternative to all sort of religious thinking, and which denies any kind of transcendence. That's the whole point of it. Nietzsche argues that despite its protestations, this atheistic scientific materialism doesn't actually get beyond the aesthetic or priestly ideal. It's still going to rely upon the logic of transcendence, just like the aesthetic priestly ideal relies on the logic of transcendence. And like what we were talking about on the first day with Nietzsche, the slave morality or the Jewish Christian morality, that logic also relies on transcendence. And Nietzsche's claim is that scientific materialism also relies on the same sort of logic of transcendence. All right, so why is this the case? Why is this true? Because this is sort of a shocking claim. The reason Nietzsche gives in justifying this: scientific materialism holds as its highest value truth. What do scientists do? Quite literally, they pursue truth. Right? And then they reject the false. Right? Pursue the truth, reject the false. Indeed, this is, I must find the word pursue right. This is why scientific materialism denies that God exists. That's why it's atheistic. Right? And so since it's not true that God exists, people shouldn't believe it. And at the very least, we will not believe it, right? We value truth. Like maybe those silly fundamentalist Christians, maybe they need to cling to these sort of outmoded, childish ideas like God. But we scientists, we educated people, we elevated people, whatever, right? Like we don't need to rely on such lies, right? Such childish fantasies. We will face the world as it really is, as it truly is, and accept it as it is, and we'll reject everything that's false. Right? So the ideal is the ideal of the true. And Nietzsche says the idea of truth is it presupposes that there's therefore the false. And so it preserves the same logic. It preserves the same transcendent. There's the true world, and a false world. For example, the true world that actually doesn't contain God, but the false world that the fundamentalists, evangelical Christians maintain. And inside that false world, there's a God, but inside the true world, there is no God. It preserves the dichotomy. It's the same transcendent logic that the ascetic priests were using in their sort of way of characterizing the distinction between a true and an apparent world. And so for Nietzsche, this doesn't get outside of anything. All right. So this is what led to some really good, great student questions. I'm not going to be able to perfectly recreate them, unfortunately, but I'll try to create at least the essence. So the basic thrust of people's questions were sort of like, well, okay, but why can't science just say, no, it's good to value the truth? Like that's not any sort of, anything that's sort of pointing at any kind of transcendence, right? The truth that scientists are concerned with isn't truth about some mystical heaven realm where God exists. It's truth about the physical world around us, right? So where's the transcendence coming in? How is it sort of emerging? And where Nietzsche thinks it's actually emerging is in the very idea of valuing truth itself. The question that Nietzsche would always point and always push back with anything to is, okay, you say truth is really important. Why? Scientist, you say it's really important to only believe true things and not to believe false things. Okay, why is that really important? Give me a scientific proof that I should only care about true things, not false things. What would that look like, right? And it's not actually clear what that could possibly look like, because science isn't in the business, if you want to put it in this way, of defining values, right? Science is in the business of maybe describing what's true and false about the world, but none of that gives you a reason for why you should actually care about what's true or false in the world. You might say that science presupposes that truth is valuable, but it doesn't actually have any justification that it can offer internal to itself for why it would. And actually, even if it did, Nietzsche wouldn't think that would help, because if science proves that you should value what science says you should value, that's begging the question. That's already presupposing we should value the things that science values, right? The thing that science can't actually justify, and this isn't just true about science, this should be true about anything else too. The thing that everything that tries to replace modern religion depends upon is values that they can't themselves justify. So let's just deal with this as an example, truth, right? Why is truth something that people have ever valued? Why think that we're right to do so? I mean, if I'm one of those warrior nobles, right, and you say, hey, guess what? You're actually not that impressive. Why is it better for me to believe that than to believe that I am impressive? If I find it way more fun to think that I'm impressive, so why shouldn't I just think I'm impressive? Or if someone were to say, hey, guess what? There is no God. What's to stop the Christian from being like, so what? I'm going to believe in one anyway. I don't care if it's not true. Why should I value truth? Why should I find truth valuable? That's the thing that doesn't have any sort of justification. Truth is just valuable because it's valuable to the scientist, right? The source of values, historically, they've all been justified by appeal to the transcendent. The most simplistic version of this is way more sophisticated versions of it, but the most simplistic version of this is just like, why should you value truth? Because God says so. That's actually a pretty good reason, right? I mean, if there really is a God, and if God is everything Christianity says God is, the fact that God says care about truth would indeed be a pretty good reason to think that truth is valuable. Without that, there's no ground or no foundation for the belief. The belief is sort of uprooted. There's no more reason to believe that truth is important than that truth is not important. Right? The important sort of language that Nietzsche uses here is that the highest values devalue themselves. Right? It's not so much that just there's no value to the belief in truth, or we're not sure if truth is valuable. The problem is the only reason scientists believe in truth is because they're coming from some transcendent background, and then they use that to destroy transcendence. Right? We have a snake eating its own tail. Right? We are going nowhere here. The very logic that leads science to say there's no transcendent world, there is no God, is itself undermined by the scientists reaching that conclusion. The only thing that ever justified truth was an appeal to something transcendent. It is some sort of higher value. There's no proof in the world of why truth is useful. And come up with anything you want. Some of the example students came up with, okay, what people just said, like, pleasure is valuable. Why? Why say pleasure is valuable? Prove it to me that you are right to think that pleasure is valuable. Some people are masochists, and they enjoy pain. You say, well, okay, at the very least, it's good to live as long as possible. Why? Why is that valuable? Right? The noble warrior people that Nietzsche was talking about, those people were looking for an early glorious death. They would love nothing more than to die heroically in battle rather than wasting away of old age and irrelevance. Right? Whatever you say is valuable, and say whatever you want, right? Whatever you say is valuable, what justifies its value? Prove it. Prove to me that it really is valuable, and you're not just making it up. And Nietzsche just thinks you're not going to be able to do it. The only justification that could ever exist for values, Nietzsche says, is the transcendent. No transcendent, no justification for values. And that is the sense in which scientific materialism and anything else that tries to replace Christianity, why it's going to assume the same sort of transcendent logic, the same sort of aesthetic ideal of the priestly class that the priestly class did, or that the slave morality did. That's the sense in which when Nietzsche says God is dead, no one's realized it yet. No one has realized just how much is at stake in eliminating God. All right, I hope that did at least a decent enough job of covering that conversation we had in class. I'll stop the video now, and then we'll just start right from where the recording sort of actually finally started to kick in. And it's right where we sort of stopped going over the past material and started discussing the new Heidegger material and his reading of Nietzsche for today. All right, then let's start with the new for today. So let's just talk a little bit briefly, just to begin with, about who Heidegger actually is. Okay. So quite literally, Heidegger is a crazy Nazi. Like quite literally. I mean that like right? He is literally a Nazi, like in the sense that, like, if not in the sense that we say on the internet, oh, that's like a Nazi thing to believe. He was actually a member of the Nazi Party in Germany in the 30s and 40s. So why are we bothering to read him at all? One, he's probably the most important philosopher of the 20th century, sort of without question. This is just sort of inarguable. His importance can't be overstated. If I had to defend Heidegger at all, and I don't really have to because I'm not a Heideggerian, but to defend him at least a little bit, he was a very bad Nazi. The Nazis themselves didn't like him very much. He didn't do it very well. I don't know if that makes it better or worse, right? But at the very least, he wasn't a very good Nazi. And the other reason why we're not really going to worry about this problem to any great extent for today, we're only going to be concerned with him as a reader of Nietzsche. And so we don't really need to worry about any of his own actual thoughts or ideas or anything like that. We're just going to use him as an interpreter of Nietzsche because he's a pretty good interpreter. And he does a pretty good job with interpreting Nietzsche. He's quite valuable in all kinds of other arenas, but we need to do more justification about how we were going to read him, and we're just not going to worry about any of that. For our purposes, we're just going to use Heidegger as a Nietzsche interpreter, and not really worry about any of his ideas or his thoughts. We're just going to use him as someone to read Nietzsche. So that's my little brief summary of who Heidegger is and why we're taking him seriously. In terms of what we are interested in today, we are interested in two sort of highly related questions. What does Nietzsche mean by God is dead? Right? When Nietzsche says that, what does he mean by that? And what does Nietzsche mean by nihilism? These are the two big questions for really both today and Tuesday as well. Both questions will be the ones we sort of focus on. They're both deeply interrelated questions. What nihilism means fundamentally has to do with what the death of God is and what the death of God means in Nietzsche. So we'll sort of treat these two questions together. We're more going to focus on the death of God today and nihilism on Tuesday, but again, they're so closely related to one another that we'll sort of be talking about both ideas both days. We'll sort of use Heidegger's interpretation of Nietzsche so that just so we didn't have to read all the thousands of different places Nietzsche says little weird aphorisms that are important to understanding what he means by all of this. So let's just start by defining a few terms. So metaphysics, let's talk about that. Right. So the way Heidegger defines this for Nietzsche is this is the truth of what is. Right. So it's fundamentally connected with notions of truth and notions of being, which we'll talk about more. Again, that'll be more next class period. More generally, what this word literally means, it's a Greek word, it literally means beyond physics. When Aristotle was writing books, he first wrote a book called The Physics, and then he wrote a book after that, and he called that book The Metaphysics, the after physics, the book that came after the book The Physics. If we want to put this slightly differently, what we mean by it, we mean an account of why the physical world is the way that it is. Okay. So atomism is a metaphysical theory. Why is the world the way that it is? Not modern atomism, ancient atomism. Why does the world work the way that it is? Because there are these atoms these atoms explain why the world is the way that it is. Right? So the physical or natural world is some particular way. Metaphysics explains why it's that way. So at least in principle, right, what's talking about the physical natural world? Presumably that's science, right? The job of science is presumably, or natural science, as it used to be called, is to tell us what is the physical world actually like, and then metaphysics will tell us why it's like that. Why is the world that way? And indeed, that's what's going on in Aristotle when he writes this book, The Metaphysics, right? First, in the physics, he sort of laid out how nature is, and then he tried to explain, okay, well, why is nature that way? What explains that nature is that way? Implicit, at least in the tradition of talking about metaphysics, is a distinction between being and appearance. There's how the world really is. This is the metaphysical truth. And then there's how the world appears to be. And this is explained by the metaphysical truth. Right. So this is first. So when Heidegger starts talking about metaphysics, in particular, what he's referring to is this last part, right? There's what is it that justifies why the world is the way that it is, that explains why the world is the way that it is, right? Metaphysical truth. So we were talking about values earlier, right? What justifies the value of truth? The metaphysical, the true metaphysical reality. That's what was supposed to justify why we should pursue truth. What was supposed to justify why I should like pleasure. The true metaphysical reality is supposed to be what justifies that. At least initially, this is not especially a theological notion. This has nothing to do with God as such. And that's even more than God. Let's say it has to do with religion, anyway. It doesn't have anything to do with religious truth or anything like that. This is simply the way that philosophers try to understand the world. Right? Its motivations aren't faith. Its motivations are, if you want to put it this way, they're rational motivations. And indeed, when metaphysics sort of is getting, if you want to use this language, when it's getting invented, right? The invention of metaphysics occurs from a bunch of pagans, at least in the Western world, right? It's Plato, it's Aristotle, right? It's these people who don't have any sacred book, who aren't particularly interested in justifying any particular set of beliefs about God. They're doing this as an effort to give sort of an account to the world, and the account that they ultimately give distinguishes the sensible world from the super sensible. And this is sort of the tool. I'm going to mostly talk about Plato in this context, because both Heidegger and Nietzsche are going to identify the history of metaphysics as Platonism. So that I'll just use Plato as my. I think they're probably right too, actually. So I'm just going to use Plato as my example for this. So when Plato tries to understand how the world is the way that he is, he thinks that the sensible world isn't explanatorily adequate in its own terms. He has to appeal to something beyond it to explain it. Okay, so let me just stop there. Any questions just so far? That's just trying to define some philosophy terms for people who might not have been familiar with them. So any questions about any of that to start with? All right, good. So one thing that is going to be really important to note, when I was defining the super sensible and the sensible, I had to do it in terms of the other, right? These are sort of mutually intertwined ideas. The sensible world only makes sense as that world that gets explained by the super sensible. If you got rid of the super sensible, the sensible world doesn't make any sense either. That was literally the point of it. The whole point. The sensible just doesn't work on its own. It needs something more to actually make it make sense. we're actually going to spend a day. I'm going to try to give you all a real quick crash course in Platonic metaphysics. It'll be really fast. If you actually want to do any of this in any sort of actual depth, take medieval philosophy with me next. I think it's probably going to be offered next spring, where we'll go over this in great depth, or take ancient philosophy class. Well, that actually go into it too. But I'm going to go super hand wavy with a lot of this. Okay. That's the whole point of it. If you get rid of the super sensible world, you also don't have the sensible world doesn't make any sense either. The whole logic here is that the sensible world isn't adequate on its own. Something more is needed to explain it. So when Plato, what he does is his metaphysical system, which again, we'll go into more depth of this later, he posits these things that he calls forms. These forms are supposed to explain the world around me. But his sort of sense is that, hey, I see a lot of cows, but why are they all cows? Why do we use the same word to address all of them? And it's not just a linguistic point, we seem right to do so. It seems like I really should use the same word to address that as a cow, that as a cow, that as a cow. But why? They're all different things. There must be some form, cow, a super sensible nature that explains why all those things are cows, right? So each cow doesn't individually explain why it's a cow. There's a form, one form, that explains why they're all cows. And he's doing this for purely rational reasons. He thinks he needs to do it to explain the world. Whether he's right or wrong is an entirely different matter, and sort of irrelevant, actually, for our purposes. He's not doing it because he's trying to prove the Christian God. He's 500 years before the Christian God was even a thing that needed to be proved. He's doing it because he thinks this is just the best way that he has available to him to explain or account for the world. So how are we doing? Is this all good to start us off with? Any questions so far? Okay. So if all of this is right up to this point, if we get rid, as Nietzsche thinks we need to, if God is dead, what is our problem? What does that mean according to Heidegger? What that means is that the Christian God, people can't believe in it anymore. Notice, that's a claim about you, not God. Right? Heidegger's claim is not, Nietzsche's claim is not that anything actually happened to God. Right? Nietzsche's a hardened atheist. Nietzsche doesn't think the Christian God ever existed. Right? This isn't a claim about that. So what does it mean to say that God is dead? That's a claim about you. You all, and me, all of us, we in the West, we can no longer believe in the Christian God anymore. Right? Almost most of all the Christians. But the people who are still calling themselves Christians, most of all, can't actually believe in it. But none of us can believe in God anymore. This is the claim. All right. But what is God? What is the Christian God? Right. That's just a shorthand for the supersensory world in general. Platonism. Right? And again, that's what we're just going to use. That's what both Nietzsche and Heidegger use as their paradigmatic example of this sort of super sensible. Platonism is no longer something people can actually believe. And again, let's make this more vivid, because we're not even just talking about like beliefs as much. It's not something that can animate people or that people can live on the basis of. So that's what this death is. The idea of God no longer has power over me. And this might seem like, just on the face of it, a deeply questionable assertion to make, right? There's lots of people who still say they believe in God just fine, right? But I mean, if we contrast modern Christians with religion in the Middle Ages, I think we'll see a little bit, at least maybe get like a little bit of a hint of what it is that Nietzsche's pointing toward here, right? Like the entire structure of Middle Ages life in every single regard, personally, socially, societally, and then beyond, all of that was the way that it was. People justified the way that it was. No one rocked the boat because all of it was in reference to God. Here's an example. In the Middle Ages, it was illegal. It was illegal to charge interest on a loan. It's called usury, because Christ has some very negative things to say about usury in the New Testament. Right? He speaks quite negatively about the practice, that it's intrinsically sinful, and indeed Christ says all kinds of things like that. Also, Christ says that it's easier to get into heaven if you're it's far easier for the poor than the rich to get into heaven. It's bad to charge goods for services, yada yada yada. Okay. So price gouging, Christ actually said, there's a few places where Christ says some pretty negative things about that, actually, in the New Testament. In the Middle Ages, the idea of God was so powerful that usury was actually illegal. It was illegal for people to charge interest on loans. And when people did it, they felt really bad about it. You constantly had these wealthy merchants going into confession, confessing their sins about it. All right. Now, again, we'll try to state this without making any sort of modern political statements about anything. Can you imagine modern Christians' belief in God being strong enough to make usury disappear? They will no longer charge interest on loans. And again, just look around us. Just look at the world around us. Right? Is that what we see being articulated? Does the idea of God have that level of power anymore? Because indeed, it's just as true in the Middle Ages as it is today that usury is really, really great if you want to make a lot of money. And it's just as true in the Middle Ages that people really wanted to make a lot of money as it is today. Nothing's changed with any of that. But the idea of God was powerful enough that in the Middle Ages, people either outright restrained themselves from this practice, or at least they felt awful about it and constantly went to confession about it. Does the idea of God have that same power today? Could it have that same power today for the modern Christian? At the very least, Nietzsche's claim is no. At least by and large, at least on any sort of large, maybe there are individual Christians that it could. But by and large, no, the idea of God simply doesn't have that much power anymore. Religion is just one part of people's lives who still are religious. It's not the totalizing principle of their own whole life. And so my religious beliefs have very little to do with my economic practices. Right? Or perhaps, maybe even with many Christians, with their moral practices. Right? Religion is just something I do on Sundays. You hear that sort of language, right? The idea just doesn't have the same power that it once did. Okay, so how are we doing? Is that at least just giving a sort of a superficial plausibility to this claim that the idea of God doesn't have the same power that it once did? Anyone want to push back or challenge? Right, then let's keep going. All right, so if all that's right, we've got a problem if this is true. This means that the supersensory no longer justifies the sensible world. Because that was what it did, right? Why did I do the things that I did in the Middle Ages? Because God told me to do them, right? And again, even if I disobeyed God, even if I was sinful in some sense, right? I sort of knew that's what I was doing. I was being a sinner. Even that's sort of doing what God, right? Like the terms that I would use to define myself were the terms set forth by God. But if that's the case, the sensible world doesn't justify itself. That was the whole point of going to a super sensible world. So what is my condition? My condition is that of having no justification for any of my values for any way that I choose to live. The very source of justification, that's what's gone. That's what God in Nietzsche means. God in Nietzsche is just shorthand for the thing that justifies stuff. If you get rid of the thing that justifies stuff, there are now no justifications for stuff. I might not recognize that. I might not realize that that's what's happened, but that is indeed what has happened. And so what justifies myself? What slides in? Well, indeed, nothing is stopping other values from just taking God's place. Maybe I can do that. Could that work? What are some candidates? And Heidegger goes through basically everything we've talked about this semester in the Taylor. All the things that got put in God's place. We could put in maybe the idea of civilization. Maybe that idea will now be what justifies things. Maybe I could put in, I don't know, rationality, reason, or the truth. Maybe that can be the highest value. Maybe the highest value could be my individual earthly happiness. Maybe it could be the collective happiness. Maybe it's art and creativity. Maybe that's the most important thing. Maybe that's what I should strive for in my life. Maybe it's business. Maybe that's the highest thing that I should pursue in life. Okay, maybe it's the state. Maybe that's the thing that I should pursue above all else. Hello, fascism. Again, this is why Heidegger's a really bad Nazi. Because he's able to point out things like this. Right? Maybe I could, but okay, but note all of these things. Why were any of these things that we thought valuable in the first place? We saw this throughout the Taylor. All of those things are only valuable in the first place because Christianity said they were valuable things. Christianity is the one that pushed this idea that we should civilize people, that we should have everyone working on the same speed. Christianity was the one that was saying, no, we should care about reason and truth. That's one way we can gain access to what God is like. Christianity is the one that said, no, what matters is sort of earthly happiness when Christ heals the sick. Right? Christianity is the one that says, no, we should think about the collective good. Christianity is the one that says creativity is good, because creativity, as Heidegger points out, creativity is an attribute of God. God is the creative one when God creates the world. Literally, creativity and creation, right? God is the creative one. He was the creator. He was the reason you would think creation was valuable in the first place, right? And indeed, it was all those wacky Protestants with their work ethic who were the ones that were saying that business was valuable, and it was Christian accounts of politics that were the one that's saying you had a Christian duty to your state. All of those values that get thrown in the place of Christian values, they're just other Christian values by another name. And the justification of all of those things actually is God. Get rid of God, get rid of all those values. Right? At one point, Nietzsche writes, Christianity is an entirely consistent system. And if you believe in it, everything it says is important. It justifies why those things are important. But if one gives up Christianity, one gives up the right to Christian values. Because Christian values only make sense in the context of the whole system of Christianity. Outside of that context, these values are valueless. it was the justification for them. And so if now, for the sake of these things, again, think back to the Taylor here. Taylor is very much in the same tradition as Heidegger and Nietzsche, though he's coming from a very different perspective, but he's in the same tradition. Think of him in this context, right? Like, if the reason I'm going to give up Christianity is because it doesn't seem civil, it seems like Christianity leads to religious violence, or I'm going to give up Christianity because it just seems irrational in some sense, or because it stifles my individual happiness, or because it doesn't promote collective happiness. That's what John Stuart Mill argued. Or because Christianity sort of stifles the ability of artists to be creative, or gets in the way of business pursuits, or for the sake of the state. All of those things that I'm saying I'm going to use to replace Christianity, those things were only ever valuable in the first place because of Christianity. Christianity was the thing that said there was value to any of those things. The highest values devalue themselves. Okay, we're got to start a new slide. Sorry. Little underlines don't make sense either anymore. And Taylor was making this point again and again and again throughout the secular age. The claim in the 1800s, when you first start getting sort of like atheism as a real thing, the claim made by the atheists is that they're being more Christian than Christian in a certain sense. The things that Christianity did well, atheism does them better. Or we can do all those same things without having God. But why would you want to do any of those things outside of Christianity? Christianity is the justification of why things can be valuable in the first place. It is the place, the supersensible is the place of ideals. When I look around me, I don't see values. I can't measure values. I can't count values. Values aren't atoms. Values don't exert forces upon things. What do values seem to be scientifically? They're psychological things that humans happen to value for some stupid reason. Because what are humans scientifically? A bunch of random atoms floating in an indifferent, valueless void. The values themselves don't show up sensibly. And why those are the right values, that doesn't show up sensibly either. That shows up only in the supersensible. Supersensible is the justification of why these things were ever valuable in the first place. How are we doing here? Is this making sense? Are you getting a rough sense of the sort of Nietzschean argument? At least as Heidegger is telling the story. Is this clear? Is this? I want to just check and make sure. Am I making sense at all? I just want some confirmation. It's harder for me to tell in this format. Am I actually making sense or not? So if people have questions or thoughts, to make sure that I'm making sense, let's do so. Okay. I'm going to interpret your silence as that I am making sense. So that is dangerous. Okay, Rowan, go ahead.
Yeah. So, like, what would Nietzsche then say about, like, I mean, however bad of idea it might be, like, what if we were to put just like Darwin kind of, whatever ideas survive are the best ideas, and like the strength of an idea merits its own.
Sure, but so you could say that, but again, what justifies that principle of valuing things?
Yeah, well, it's just like evolution, right?
But what justifies? But I guess, but Nietzsche is always going to come back to you with is, but what justifies why you should care about that? Like, why should you care about any of that?
Right. Yeah. And I guess it could be because, like, well, we are here, right? Because of evolution. So because that's how we got here.
So is it
That's
because
where
we owe
go.
gratitude to evolution because evolution is our creator?
Not even that. Like
What does that
more
sound
we
like?
are.
I was joking a
Yeah.
little bit, right? But what does that sound like again? I just put Darwin in the place
Yeah.
of God.
Right.
Right?
That's true. Yeah.
I'm putting, so it's, I haven't gotten rid of the system. I just put something new where God used to be, and something that's infinitely less suited for the job. God was way more suited for
Yeah.
the job of being the justifier of all values than Darwin is. So I can put him in that place, right? But he's not going to do it as well. And anyway, I'm just preserving the same system. I'm preserving the same thing that I was supposed to be getting rid of, the transcendent spot, the spot for the super sensible, the spot that's supposed to be the justification for all other things.
Yeah. Okay.
Does that?
I mean, yeah, I think there's maybe more that I'd like to disagree with, but I need to kind of like probably work on that a little bit and try to.
And we're going to have
articulate that a bit
time.
more.
We're going to keep
Yeah.
going with this too.
Yeah,
Because,
maybe
I mean,
I could put it in my essay.
yeah, exactly. Because the cool, or the one way you could have made this might be a helpful, at least, starting point. Think of the super sensible as a place. Once you get rid of God, you could put anything in that place, but you haven't changed the system at all, right? You still have the same structure, and the thing you put in the place isn't going to do as good of a job as God did. God is the perfect thing to justify values. Anything else you try to put in that same place is going to do a worse job than God did at it. It's going to be
Okay.
more arbitrary, more accidental, and anyway, you preserve the same system anyway. You still have that transcendent place, the super sensible place. So you should have just left
Yeah.
God in the first place, since he's better at it, in a sense,
Yeah.
than Darwin could be or whatever.
Right. And I mean, survival of the fittest isn't a very good like way to structure the world. I mean,
Yeah,
really.
it doesn't. It's just not going to be explanatorily adequate in lots of ways. Like, it's just going to fail as an explanation of the world.
Yeah, and it's
So
too primal.
probably even more, even if you think God fails as an explanation, God's probably a better explanation, at least, of the unified theory of everything. God's a way better unified theory of everything than Darwinism is, or even social Darwinism, or whatever.
Okay, thanks.
Absolutely. All right, like a bunch of hands. I think I saw Kendall's hand next. So go ahead.
One thing that is kind of bothering me is that he seems to, I mean, it sounds like he seems to posit that God, like he himself doesn't believe that God exists. And this idea of God as dead is just the idea of God like being of value, not God himself, I guess.
Yeah, right.
And what's confusing to me about that is if you're going to believe that there is no God and that because of that there is no justification for what's happening, then what is he like? Does he think there might be something else, or is he think like justification is subjective? There's not really a good or bad. It's all just a subjective thing. Like, where does that end up?
This is a really good question, and one that Nietzsche himself can't answer. And he admits it. He says as much. He doesn't know. Yeah. What he's hoping is once people really stop pretending that everything is just the same as it was, it will lead to the creation of new values. It'll lead to the creation of a new system, one that isn't predicated upon this super sensible distinction in the first place, and he doesn't know what it will look like. I'll tell you, Heidegger is usually put in the existentialist tradition. The existentialists think it looks like them. The existentialists think they're the right answer to the challenge or the puzzle that Nietzsche is setting forth. Heidegger's a very weird existentialist too, though. I don't know that Heidegger thinks he actually answers the question Nietzsche is raising either exactly. But that's at least one way people go to answer. Existentialism, postmodernism, those traditions sort of say that's what it'll look like. And it's not exactly subjective-objective, because that's on the old terms. It's not exactly any of the old stuff. It's not going to be easily said in terms of any of the other old stuff. It'll be some new system of evaluating. But indeed, those new systems of evaluation do sort of end up, like, existentialism sort of ends up almost, again, sort of eating its own tail in a certain sense. Like, it's not at all clear that existentialism got out of this either, or that postmodernism gets out of all this either. Derrida ends up in sort of the same basic puzzle that Nietzsche ended up with, that he can't justify why he values anything that he's doing, and so it's not clear why he should value it. So the the Overman still seems, to me at least, if he's going to come at all, he's yet to arrive. Nietzsche's Übermensch is not here yet. We don't know what the alternative to this could look like. By the way, one alternative that Nietzsche hasn't given you any actual reason to believe that there isn't a transcendent. By the way,
Yeah,
there's
still
no
an option. There
actual
could
reason
be a
that's been
God. There
given
could
yet.
be something else.
Yeah, he's just asserting it, right? And
Yeah.
indeed, all of the existentialists, they do the same thing. They never really give an argument. No one ever really gives an argument against Platonism. It doesn't actually ever happen, weirdly. People are just like, but Plato's obviously silly, so I don't need to believe in it. And again, that fits in with this God is dead thing, right? It can't move me anymore, right? But we actually haven't. One possibility is that actually maybe the transcendent is indeed the right way to talk about all this stuff, and we should maybe not go back to being Christians in the old sense or whatever, but maybe we should go back to some sense of transcendence and try to do it better. Go back. I told you all, right? I'm a Platonist, right? Like, I don't see why that we have refuted Plato, in fact, and that maybe the right answer was just to be Plato, and that Plato was basically doing it right, and that's what we should do. That's a possibility too, at least, right? And yeah, I mean that's one of the options. Now, whether again Nietzsche's claim would just be we can't do that, people can't really believe that anymore. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but that's a very long answer. I hope that was helpful. I hope that was getting to your question at least. All right.
Yeah, it helped out.
Awesome. Good. More hands. Let's do Nick first. I saw. Go ahead.
So with Christianity setting up these other institutions like civilization, the state, business as pretty much the God in God's place.
Yep.
Why? It seems pretty self-destructive of Christianity to do such a thing, especially when its first commandment is "Thou shalt not have any God before me."
Absolutely.
Why would Christianity ever go with the idea of the separation of church and state or anything like that? Why would you ever go with capitalism to where you can separate these things rather than always having God with everything?
And that's why we read the Charles Taylor, because that was basically what he was saying. That was what he was trying to show us in the secular age. Why Christianity did this to itself. Why Christianity cannibalized itself to make modernity. Right? And what are some of the things he identified? He identified it with this strong tendency to continually push for raising all people up to just have this one speed of religious life rather than multiple speeds. And so as a result, then that one speed has to be quite a bit slower if it's one that everyone needs to be able to do. What's that going to look like? Well, it's going to look like everyone being good citizens. So we're sort of replacing the idea of being a good citizen. That sort of becomes equivalent to being religious, whereas before those have been radically distinct notions. And various similar sorts of pressures, right? Religion, we have the Protestant Reformation because we think Catholicism is corrupt, but then that just gives rise to hundreds of years of religious wars. So we now need to actually separate church and state because Christianity itself says these religious wars are bad, right? If I was a Greek pagan, I'd be like, religious wars are great. Running around, I'm killing people, pillaging, let's go, oh, this is the best. Everything's going awesome, right? Christianity is why religious wars are bad. And so for the sake of avoiding religious wars, it undermines itself. It lessens some of the fervor of itself. Right? And all the stuff that, there's just some examples from the Taylor, but everything that Taylor was sort of saying, right? This doctrine of sort of mutual benefit, that's only makes sense in the context of Christianity, but mutual benefit is best assured through economic activity. So that's that story that Taylor was telling, that's kind of the story, right? Why Christianity from trying to be Christian undermines itself, undermines Christianity. And yeah, I mean, I don't see how you could look at the Protestant Reformation, which was intended to promote the true religion and ended up destroying religion in a certain sense. I mean, I don't see how you could see it as anything other than it trying to do something and doing the exact opposite as a result. There's also in the next half of the reading, Heidegger's going to have a little bit more to say about that question too, but hopefully that's at least enough of a start for why this might happen. I've got a question. Sure. Okay, good. I've got a question in the chat. The question is, all this seems to make sense in the Western context, but how does it extend to Eastern values and worldviews? Great question. It doesn't. I don't see why Nietzsche's in any way justified in how broad he's brushing the world with. And I don't know that Heidegger thinks he is either, actually. Heidegger doesn't particularly seem to think he's justified in doing it either. One thing I can say, Hinduism and Platonism are philosophically quite similar. So there's, at least in terms of the metaphysical systems you get in Indian thought, at the very least, not really Chinese thought. You don't really get metaphysical. At least there's a lot less metaphysical thinking in Chinese thinking in general. But at least in Indian thought, the kinds of metaphysical theories you get are at least similar enough to Platonism that maybe you could say a similar kind of move has happened. But yeah, God is not dead in India. Like, God is dead in Western Europe. That piece of Nietzsche at least only applies in the Western world. So hopefully that helps with that chat question. And then we're getting near the end of class for today, which is fine. We've done pretty much what I wanted to do today. So we'll end. Tim, go ahead. You can be the last question for the day.
So what about pragmatic justification?
Mm-hmm.
Would that be too like relativistic and not solid enough for Nietzsche and Heidegger, or would it maybe work? Because I mean, it is relative in a sense because you have to have some goal you're directed at, but essentially it's justified if it works.
So here would be at least Nietzsche's rejoinder. Let me just do it from his side at least. Nietzsche's rejoinder. Okay, what do we actually mean by pragmatic theory of truth? What do we actually mean by it works?
Dewey or James,
yeah, right.
You know.
And we're going to read some James actually later on. So
yeah.
But how would Nietzsche respond to them? His response would be, okay, but what do they actually mean by it works? If you really, again, I'm being Nietzsche here. I'm not necessarily saying my own view, but at least if I'm Nietzsche, if you really dive into it, what do we mean by works? We mean something like economically productive, economically useful, something like that. That's not going anywhere. That's just the same old thing again. That's just building in the marketplace as the new god, or the invisible hand, Adam Smith's invisible hand as the new god, governing everything. And that's just preserving the same thing. That's just as nihilistic. Now, the pragmatist would come back and say, no, that's not what we mean. But I'm not sure, at least from Nietzsche's perspective anyway, that they're going to be able to articulate what they do mean clearly enough in such a way that they're going to get out of this nihilistic puzzle that he's presenting. Because yeah, like, you have to work with respect to some value, and what's going to justify that value. At least that's going to be Nietzsche's claim anyway. So does that work as a...
Yeah. So it's kind of like they might say, well, pragmatism, you can justify methodologies,
right,
and like ways of living, but you can't justify the values that those ways are based on.
That's right. That those ways presuppose. Yeah. Because I mean, and actually, in a sense, Nietzsche's a little bit open to this idea of pragmatism in a certain sense, right? I mean, like, what's been the most wildly successful thing in the history of the world? Slave morality, as far as Nietzsche's concerned, right? Like, slave morality completely has dominated the Western world and maybe the entire world, right? And so, in a sense, then, yeah, it is indeed stronger than those warrior mythoses. It had a kind of power those things didn't. It was very unhealthy, right? So it's bad in that regard. But why should we care about that? I mean, we don't have any justification for it. So yeah, I mean, we can still even like recognize that there's something to this sort of pragmatic way of evaluation, and still but still say, but what justifies that as a system of evaluation in the first place? There is no ground. I guess that's the idea of all of this. The idea of nihilism is there's no ground for anything. That makes it seem like everything is meaningless. That might not be true, but at least makes it seem like everything is meaningless if there's no ground to support it. All right. So we're done time-wise for the day. So we'll let everyone go, and we'll just basically pick up right from here next time. So I know there were some hands I didn't get to. But we'll sort of write it down, hold on to it, and we can begin class with them, because we'll start next class period right from the same place that we're ending with. All right. Have a great weekend, everyone. If anyone has paper issues or concerns, let me know. And otherwise, I will see you all on Tuesday. Thank you very much. And yeah, if anyone wants to chat actually, I can't really chat today. I kind of have to run because I have a office hours meeting that I have to go to. But have a great weekend, everyone. And I will talk to everyone later. If anyone does have any sort of issues, just send me an email and we'll go over them. We can go over them in that format. Bye.
Thank you.